Imagine waking up and realizing every breath you take, every ache in your bones, every shadow in your mind, was decided centuries before you were born. Not by fate, but by your own ancestors, obsessed with keeping their bloodlines pure, even if it meant destroying their children. This is the hidden history of royal families, and the people trapped in their genetic cages. Section 1. The Awakening. Elisabetha von Greifenstadt woke to the slow creak of shutters swinging in the morning wind. A pale, winter light slid across the carved canopy above her bed, catching in the gold leaf so that it shimmered like a crown. She felt the familiar heaviness in her chest before she even tried to move, the tight, uneven pull of her ribcage, the shallow breath that left her lightheaded as she sat up too quickly. She pulled herself upright, ignoring the dull ache in her hips, and pressed her palms into her thighs to steady the trembling. A silver hand mirror lay on the table beside her bed. She almost didn't reach for it. The reflection had never been kind, but something in her this morning demanded a confrontation. The face staring back was not yet 20, but the lines around the mouth and the shadow beneath her eyes told of a lifetime already spent in struggle. Her lower jaw jutted forward, making her lips close awkwardly. Her teeth did not meet. Her shoulders were narrow, her neck too thin to hold her head comfortably. "God has tested me again," she murmured in the old tongue her nurse had taught her. From the far side of the room, her maid Greta paused in her folding. "Pardon, mein Fräulein?" "Nothing," Elisabetha said, setting down the mirror. But her mind was already tumbling into the thought that had haunted her since childhood, that her body's betrayals were not the work of God's will at all, but of her family's own hand. When she was 11, she had overheard two footmen talking as they polished armor in the gallery. "They say her mother was her father's cousin," one had whispered. "Closer than that," the other replied, shaking his head. "The same grandfather. Twice over." She'd run before they could see her, heart hammering so hard it hurt. That night she had asked her mother directly. The Archduchess, resplendent in her pearls, had gone still. "You are of the purest blood, Elisabetha. It is our sacred duty to keep it so. One day you will understand." But Elisabetha had understood already, not in the way her mother meant, but in the quiet, dawning horror of realizing that the same polished portraits hanging in the dining hall were not merely ancestors but the tangled knots of a tree that grew in on itself. Faces repeated. The same eyes in cousin after cousin. The same jaw. Today, as the bells from St. Ulrich tolled in the distance, she wondered how many of those ancestors had woken with the same ache in their bones, the same weight on their lungs, and whether any of them had dared to curse the tradition that had damned them. Section 2. The Gallery of Ghosts. The morning rituals of the Greifenstadt Palace were as precise as clockwork. By the time Elisabetha stepped into the eastern corridor, her nursemaids had already been replaced by the stiff-backed attendants who handled her public hours. The scent of beeswax polish filled the air, masking the faint must of the old stone walls. She walked slowly, her silk slippers whispering over the carpet, each step careful so her weak hips did not betray her in front of the watching servants. The eastern corridor ended in the Gallery of Ancestors, a long hall lined with oil portraits, so large they seemed like doorways into another time. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, striking the gold frames so the eyes within seemed to glimmer. Her tutor, Master Reinhardt, waited at the far end, bowing stiffly when she approached. "Your Highness, today we begin with the reign of Wilhelm II. He secured—" "I know," Elisabetha interrupted. "He secured the Rhineland by marrying his niece." Reinhardt hesitated, his gaze flicking to the nearest portrait, a narrow-faced man with the same deep-set eyes Elisabetha saw in her own mirror. "Indeed," he said at last. They moved down the road together. She recognized more than a few features that repeated, the long, thin noses, the curved upper lips, and always that jaw. At her mother's portrait, Elisabetha stopped. The artist had softened the angles of the face, blurred the prominence of the chin, but even through the flattery, she saw the truth. "My mother married her cousin," she said quietly. Reinhardt's jaw tightened. "It was the custom, Your Highness. The purity of the line was considered more important than the lives it ruined?" Her voice cracked like a dropped glass. He looked at her for a long moment. That is not a question your tutors are permitted to answer. She stepped past him before he could say more, her skirts brushing the marble floor. Halfway down the gallery, she found the portrait she always dreaded, Wilhelm Ivy's second daughter, Adelheid. The girl's head was tilted at a strange angle, and though the painter had tried to hide it, Elisabetha could see the bulge of the misshapen skull beneath the cascade of pearls. It was said Adelheid never spoke, never walked, and died before her 15th winter. And yet here she hung, memorialized in silks and jewels, her silence preserved for all time. Elisabetha stood before her for a long while, until Greta's voice reached her from the doorway. Your Highness, the physician awaits you in the solar. Of course he does, Elisabetha murmured, still staring into Adelheid's unblinking eyes. Section 3. The Physician's Verdict. The solar was flooded with pale winter light, its tall windows framed by heavy crimson drapes. A fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the room until the door shut behind Elisabetha. Dr. Kappel rose from his chair, bowing with the precision of a man who had attended to royalty for decades. His hair was silver, but his eyes were sharp and cold as he motioned for her to sit. Your Highness, he said, drawing on his gloves, we will begin as usual. Stand, if you please. Elisabetha obeyed, gripping the arm of the chair to steady herself. He circled her slowly, the way one might assess a statue for cracks. His hands pressed at her ribcage, measured the angle of her spine, lifted her chin to study the set of her jaw. Breathing? He asked. Shallow in the mornings, she replied. He made a note in his ledger. Jaw stiffness? The same. Another note. Your hips, are they still prone to dislocation? Yes. He sighed through his nose, removing his gloves. You must limit your dancing at court. Strain will only worsen the curvature. And for the breathing, more time in the gardens, fresh air. She knew the advice was useless. She had been told the same since she was a child, and nothing had changed except her awareness of why it would never change. Doctor, she said, her voice low, if my parents had married outside the family. His head snapped up. Your Highness, I must warn you. I'm not accusing. She lied. I'm only asking, could I have been different? His expression softened, just barely. Perhaps. But such matters are not for you to dwell on. The court has other priorities. She gave a bitter laugh. Yes. My marriage. The doctor's silence was all the confirmation she needed. The door opened without a knock, and her mother swept in, her gown whispering against the stone floor. The Archduchess smelled of lavender and clove, her hair piled high beneath a net of gold thread. Ah, Dr. Kappel, she said smoothly. Is my daughter fit to travel to Waldkirch? Elisabetha's stomach clenched. Waldkirch. She had heard whispers that the Duke's son, her second cousin, was to be her betrothed. Kappel cleared his throat. Fit enough, Your Grace, provided the journey is not rushed. Her mother smiled. Then it is settled. She turned to Elisabetha. You will meet your future husband at the New Year's banquet. He is of impeccable lineage. Of course he was. Section 4. The Road to Waldkirch. 3 days later, the palace gates groaned open before dawn. The sky was still bruised with the last shadows of night when Elisabetha's carriage rolled onto the frost-hardened road. Inside, she sat opposite her mother, who was wrapped in sable and already reviewing the guest list for the banquet. Outside, the hooves of the escort horses struck the frozen ground in a steady rhythm. Greta sat beside the coachman, her cheeks red with cold, but inside the carriage, the air was stifling. You must remember, the Archduchess said without looking up from her list. The Duke's son Heinrich is an opportunity. His bloodline is pure, his estate prosperous, and his loyalty to our house unquestionable. Elisabetha kept her eyes on the window. Is his jaw pure as well? Her mother's head snapped up. Mind your tongue. They rode in silence for a time, the only sound the creak of leather straps and the muffled crunch of wheels on frozen earth. In the distance, The jagged outlines of pine-covered hills grew clearer. When they stopped at a wayside inn to change horses, Elisabetha stepped out into the cold air and drew a deep breath. For a moment, her lungs expanded more easily, and the ache in her chest eased. A boy no older than 12 brought buckets of water for the horses. He stared at her openly, not with the guarded curiosity of court but with the wide-eyed wonder of someone who had never seen a princess. "Is it true you live in a house with 100 rooms?" he asked shyly. She smiled faintly. "More than that. But a room is still a room, no matter how many there are." Before he could reply, Greta appeared to usher her back inside. By midday, snowflakes began to drift across the road, catching in the horses' manes. The coach swayed as they wound through the forest. Elisabetha thought of Waldkirch, a place she had never seen, a man she had never met, a life she had not chosen. When they finally descended into the valley, the castle came into view, a pale stone fortress with towers that stabbed the winter sky, banners snapping in the wind. The air grew colder as they approached, and the drawbridge groaned under the weight of the carriage. In the courtyard, a cluster of courtiers waited, cloaks drawn tight. At their center stood a tall young man in a fur-lined cape. His hair was dark, his posture rigid, and even from a distance, Elisabetha saw the familiar tilt of the jaw. Section 5. The Duke's Son. The carriage door swung open, and Greta's gloved hand was there to steady Elisabetha as she stepped down onto the frozen cobblestones. Her breath plumed in the cold air, mingling with the white mist that hung around the horses. The young man at the center of the waiting party stepped forward. His cape was clasped with a silver stag, his boots polished to a mirror sheen. He bowed low, one hand to his chest. "Lady Elisabetha of Greifenstadt," he said, his voice smooth but distant. "Welcome to Waldkirch. I am Heinrich." She dipped in a curtsy, keeping her eyes on the snowy ground until she rose. When she met his gaze, she saw it instantly: the subtle forward thrust of the chin, the slightly thickened lower lip. It was less pronounced than her own, but unmistakable. "I thank you for your welcome, my lord," she said, her breath catching from the cold, or perhaps from the realization that she was staring at yet another branch of the same twisted vine. Her mother's voice, bright with formality, cut in. "Your Grace, we are honored to accept your family's hospitality until the new year." Heinrich's mouth curved in a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "It will be my pleasure to ensure your comfort." He extended an arm, and Elisabetha had no choice but to take it. They walked beneath the great arch into the keep. The stone walls inside were hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, stags brought down by hounds, boars cornered by spears. A great fire roared in the central hall, but the air still held a chill that crept into Elisabetha's bones. As they passed the side corridor, Heinrich lowered his voice just enough for her to hear. "I hope the journey did not trouble you. I know these roads can be taxing." She glanced at him sidelong. "I am accustomed to discomfort." A flicker crossed his expression, something that might have been understanding. "Then we have that in common." Before she could ask what he meant, a servant announced that their chambers were prepared. Heinrich released her arm, bowed again, and withdrew to join his father near the hearth. Greta led Elisabetha up the spiral staircase to her rooms. As she sank onto the edge of the bed, she replayed his words in her mind. "Then we have that in common." It was the first time anyone in her own circle had hinted, even obliquely, that they too lived with the quiet weight of an inherited curse. Section 6. Whispers in the Garden. Snow still clung to the hedges the next morning when Heinrich appeared at Elisabetha's chamber door. Greta had just finished lacing her gown when the knock came. "My lady," Heinrich's voice called through the wood. "If the air is not too bitter, I would walk with you in the gardens." Elisabetha hesitated. It was unusual for a courtship visit to come so soon, and without chaperones already in place. Still, she agreed, partly from curiosity, partly from the strange thread of recognition she'd felt in his words yesterday. The castle gardens were skeletal in winter, the flower beds bare, the fountains capped with ice. They walked along the gravel path, their breath clouding between them. "I thought we might speak plainly," Heinrich began, his hands clasped behind his back. Our families do not permit much of that. Elisabetha gave a short laugh. Plain speech is not a royal habit. Nor is honesty, he said, glancing toward the high stone wall as though it might have ears. But I think we owe each other at least that much. She studied him in the pale light. What is it you want to say? He stopped beside a frozen rosebush, brushing away a crust of snow from its thorny branches. I have been ill since I was a boy. My legs ache in the cold. My sight, it blurs if I read too long. I've been told it is the cost of our blood's purity. Elisabetha's breath caught. No one had ever spoken the words so openly to her. And yet they will marry us to keep that purity intact. His smile was humorless. They will bind two cracks together and call it strength. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of wind through the bare trees. You don't want this marriage any more than I do, she said softly. No, Heinrich admitted. But I see no path around it that does not end in ruin for us both. So perhaps we might find a way to survive it together. She looked down at the snow, at the faint pattern of gravel beneath. Survival, she repeated. That may be the truest vow either of us could make. From somewhere beyond the wall, a church bell began to toll. Heinrich offered his arm, and for the first time, she took it without hesitation. Section 7. The Banquet of Binding. The New Year's banquet was a blaze of gold and crimson against the bleak winter outside. Torches lined the great hall, their flames casting shifting shadows over the stone walls. 100 voices mingled in the air, laughter, gossip, the clatter of goblets, under the constant watch of the Duke and Archduchess seated at the high table. Elisabetha wore a gown of deep green velvet, chosen by her mother to symbolize the evergreen strength of our house. The square neckline itched against her collarbone, but she kept her chin high, aware of every pair of eyes tracking her across the room. Heinrich met her near the base of the dais. Shall we endure this together? He murmured, so low that only she could hear. They took their seats side by side as servants brought out the first course, roasted pheasant, its skin lacquered to a shine. The scent made Elisabetha's stomach knot. Eating in public was always a careful, exhausting affair. Her jaw ached by the second bite. She masked her difficulty by sipping wine, letting Heinrich carry the conversation when their tablemates asked polite, pointed questions about the match. A silver-haired count leaned forward. They say the Greifenstadt line traces unbroken to the coronation of Empress Dorothea. Remarkable continuity. Continuity, Heinrich replied smoothly, can be a blessing or a burden, depending on how one wears it. The count chuckled, missing the edge in Heinrich's tone, but Elisabetha caught it, and so, she thought, did a few others. Later, as musicians began to play, the Duke rose, goblet in hand. Friends, tonight we honor the joining of two great houses. The betrothal of my son, Heinrich of Waldkirch, to Elisabetha of Greifenstadt, unites bloodlines sanctified by centuries. A cheer went up, though it sounded to Elisabetha like the roar of a crowd watching the tightening of a noose. As she and Heinrich stood for the toast, she caught a snatch of whispered conversation from the table behind them, two ladies in pearl-studded hoods leaning close. Another cousin match. It will end as it always does. But the coffers will be full, and that is all the Duke cares for. Elisabetha felt Heinrich's hand steady her elbow as the goblets clinked. Either of them smiled. Section 8. Shadows after the feast. The banquet lingered long into the night, but eventually the music softened, and the guests began to drift away. Servants cleared the tables with quiet efficiency, carrying away the bones and the emptied platters. Elisabetha excused herself, claiming fatigue. In truth, the tightness in her jaw had grown unbearable, and the low roar of voices pressed like a weight against her temples. She slipped from the hall into a side corridor lit only by a few sputtering candles. The stone passage was colder here, and empty, or so she thought. As she passed the half-open door, the murmur of voices stopped her mid-step. Can't risk him producing another weak heir, a man's voice said, low but sharp. They won't say it, but Heinrich is not what they hoped, another answered. This match, It binds the coffers, yes, but it keeps him under watch. Elisabetha's fingers tightened on the folds of her gown. And the girl? The first man asked. She's a Greifenstadt. That's all they care about. Blood and gold. Whatever else she carries in her bones is their problem, not ours. A faint scrape of a chair made her step back quickly into the shadows. Two men emerged, one she recognized as Baron Erhard, a cousin of Heinrich's father, the other, a foreign envoy whose name she had not caught at supper. They walked past without noticing her, their voices fading into the echoing corridor. She stood there long after they were gone, her breath shallow. Another weak air, keep him under watch. The words looped in her mind, tightening something in her chest that had nothing to do with her usual pain. When she returned to the guest chambers, Greta was waiting with a basin of warm water. You're pale, mein Fräulein. Did the food not sit well? Elisabetha shook her head. No, Greta. It's something else entirely. She said no more, but as she lay in bed listening to the distant hum of voices from the great hall, she thought of Heinrich. The stiffness in his walk, the flicker of pain he tried to hide. Whatever the Duke's true intentions, this marriage was as much a leash as it was a link. Section 9. The Pact. The next morning, snow fell in a steady veil over Waldkirch. Elisabetha found Heinrich alone in the library, seated by the window with an untouched cup of tea beside him. His gaze followed the slow drift of flakes against the glass, but when she entered he looked up, his expression guarded. We need to speak, she said. He gestured to the chair opposite him. About the weather? She leaned forward. I overheard your kinsman last night. Baron Erhard. He said you were not what they hoped. That this marriage will keep you under watch. Something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, but resignation. Then you know more than most brides on the eve of their binding. They think we are both flaws in the design, she said quietly. Too fragile to lead, but useful enough to bind together. He set the tea aside untouched. They are not entirely wrong. I am not the son my father wanted. And you. He stopped himself, not unkindly. We are both shaped by choices made before we drew breath. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of snow against the window. Then Heinrich said, If they mean to use us, we might yet turn that to our advantage. Her brow furrowed. How? By presenting exactly what they expect, dutiful spouses, content to play our parts, while quietly carving out whatever life we can for ourselves. Not love, perhaps, but survival. She searched his face. And trust? His mouth curved in a small, wry smile. That would be a start. She sat back, exhaling slowly. Then it is agreed. We endure. Together. He inclined his head, as though sealing a bargain. Together. Outside, the snow thickened, softening the hard lines of the castle walls. For the first time since she'd arrived, Elisabetha felt the faintest loosening of the knot in her chest, not from hope of a different life, but from knowing she would not walk the one ahead entirely alone.